Hi everyone, welcome back to our series Go Beyond SketchUp and welcome to chapter number 2. In chapter number 1, we went back to basics. So if you haven't had the chance to have a look at these videos, I encourage you to go and check them out. And in this chapter, we are going to talk about organization. Organizing your model makes your life easier in the sense that simplifies editing and manipulation, not to mention that it saves you a lot of time. In this first video, we're going to have a look at groups and components. Groups and components are used to separate or to isolate geometry in order to manipulate your objects in a quicker and easier way. Using groups or components is a process that you should be doing from the very beginning. This is not a process just for intermediate or advanced users. The reason it's important to talk about groups and components is because you know what happens when you try to manipulate raw geometry. Like in this case, I've got these two blocks. Have a look. It's just raw geometry at the moment. So when you try to manipulate them, or when you get close to each other and they start to stick to each other, then that's when you have issues. And that's why it's not recommended to leave just loose geometry. So whatever you do, no matter how big or how complex your model is, just get in the habit of create groups and components. Okay, so I have these two blocks. They haven't been grouped. They haven't been made a component. It's just raw geometry. If you want to make a group, what do? You just select the geometry that you want to group, right click, and see the option make a group. You can also select the geometry, and if you have assigned a shortcut for group, just press the key that you have assigned for your shortcut. In my case, it's the letter G, so if I press G, it makes a group. Easy. Notice now that if I want to move that in here, if I want to go back, it doesn't stick to this geometry anymore because it's in a group. It's inside a container. The second block that I have in here, the same. I'm going to select that geometry. I'm going to right click and make a component. Again, if you have a shortcut assigned to make a component, you can do so. It's the same process, whatever is easier for you. In my case, I've got Shift G for component, so I can select, press Shift and G, and creates the component. Once you create a component, notice that you get this window here, and that's the very first difference between groups and components. Components have additional functionality that groups don't have. You can give a definition, you can give a description. There's a series of elements or attributes that you can add to your components that is not possible in your groups. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Once you create a component, and this is the second difference, once you create a component, have a look in your component window, and once you create that component, you can see it right there. At this point, component #1 because we didn't give it a name, but that's okay. For now, it's important just to know that once you create a component, it comes into this list of components in your model. And why is that important? It is important because if for whatever reason I decided to delete those elements, once the group is gone, it's gone. There's nothing you can do about it. But with the component, because it's already on my list of components, I can just drag it and drop it again and again and again. Another difference between groups and components is that components are linked to each other. They're connected to each other. And to show you that, I'm going to select the two blocks. I'm going to copy these two blocks. Let's copy them 5 times. So a general overview, it doesn't really look any different. There's 5 copies of this group, 5 copies of this component. But see what happens if I want to edit this group. Let's say I want to make it longer. That is the only instance that is going to change. In the components though, if I want to go into the components and do something similar, notice that all of them are changing. And that's because components are connected to each other. And that's a very good thing, but also something to be aware of, because if you, for instance, have a copy of this component in your drawing, and let's say your model it's got a lot of information, a lot of geometry, and then if you have this component here and then you want to change, you want to manipulate, you want to edit this component by, I don't know, making it taller, for instance, then you'll say, yeah, I'm happy with that. But then when you go back to the whole model, then you realize that because they're linked to each other, they change as well. So something to be aware of. If for whatever reason you still want that to be a component, but you don't want them to change, then what you can do is select that element, right click, and make unique. Notice that when you make unique, you get another component in your component list. So if you make unique, then you can modify this component without changing the other ones. So something to be aware of. Another thing to remember is that groups add more data to your models and therefore make your models bigger. Because in this case, we've got these groups. So SketchUp has to remember all the data for each individual group. Different to this case of the components, SketchUp only have to remember the data for one component and then just the location of this. So in terms of size, working with components, it's much better than working with groups. But again, that depends on the complexity of your models. One thing that is very important to mention, and this is a tip that you guys can use, you don't need geometry, or you don't have loose geometry and group it. You can start making a group or a component without drawing anything. And the way you do that is just by clicking anywhere on the screen. You can select make component or make a group. In this case, let's make a group. And whatever you start to draw in there is gonna be part of a group already. This is a good thing as well, especially when there's a lot of geometry in your drawing, and selecting things to make group or a component could be a little bit tricky. So that avoids that situation of having to do a lot of different things in order to select the geometry that you want to be part of that group or that component. Now, the question is always, what should I use? Should I use groups? Should I use components? Which one is better? It's always up to the end user. Whatever you feel more comfortable with, but I always try to go with the following questions in my head. If it's something that is going to repeat, then I will make a component. If it's something that I have to create a report about, materials, about sizes, then I create a component, because the component, I can assign those attributes to components and then create reports about that. And if I want to do a dynamic component, then of course you do a component. So it's honestly up to you, whatever you use. But just remember that even if you use just groups, then you a click away of making a component. Like in this case, I have created this group in here, like we showed before. But if you do right click, you can make that as a component as well. I guess don't be afraid to use groups or component as long as your geometry is organized and named and grouped in the right way, because you always can change whatever you've done. Now, another important thing to mention is the concept of nesting. And basically what the concept of nesting is, just put groups or put components inside another group or another component. It's basically put containers within containers, which also makes your life easier. Let's say that we've got these 6 blocks in here and I want to move them at the same time, instead of just select one and select the other one, or make a window, because it's sometimes selecting things is a little bit tricky. I can always just select that, right click, make a group or a component, and then they're all inside another container. And that makes, like I said, editing and manipulating process a little bit easier in terms of, copy, paste, modifying, etc., etc. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Now, with components, a lot of people, and I've seen this a lot of times, is that I have created a component and I make copies of that component, but when I modify the initial component, the others don't change. And the reason why that happens is because remember that component is just a container. If you want to modify an element, you have to go inside the container. And what I mean by that is, if for any reason I just want to make this bigger and I'm gonna scale it, for instance, notice that what I'm doing in there is not affecting the other ones. And the reason why is because I'm modifying the container. What you have to keep in mind is that you have to modify what is inside the container. And in order to do that, you have to go and double click to be inside that container, and then select what you want to modify. And if you want to do like we did before, then in that case, you can see that all of them are going to change. So that's something to remember. To don't modify the container, modify what is inside the container. And especially if nesting, you have to make sure that you go to inside the right container to modify any particular geometry that you want. I think that's take us to the end of this video. So if you like this video, just press like and subscribe to our channel, and also just leave us a comment. Just let us think what you think about these videos. We're happy to hear from you guys, and any suggestions, any topics that you want to cover. Happy to see what you guys think, and I hope you learned something new. Well, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.